So just want to take a moment to introduce our speaker today and to welcome Dr. Chakraborty. So TC Chakraborty did his bachelor's degree in civil engineering in West Bengal University of Technology, went on to do a master's in environmental engineering and management at the Indian Institute of Technology, which I don't know about you, TC, but I think of that as India's kind of MIT. Um, and then a master's in earth and environmental science at Yale University, followed by a doctoral degree in earth and environmental science at Yale University. He's now a scientist in the Earth System Modeling Group at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, working on biosphere atmosphere interactions. We're also very grateful to have him as a collaborator in our DOE funded Massachusetts Gateway Cities Climate Resilience Center. And with that, I'll just pass it on to TC and ask you all to join me in welcoming him and giving him our attention. Thanks, TC.
Thanks, Juliet. So I will turn off my video and that make
To
things a
save
little.
on the internet. Yep.
Yep.
Me too. Gotcha.
So I'm going to be talking about multiple lines of evidence on urban heat across scales. Next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of an overview of the presentation. I'm going to be talking about urban heat across scales, surface versus air temperature, and then urban humidity feedback. Next slide. And starting with the urban heat across scales. Next slide. Yeah, so cities tend to be warmer than their surroundings, and this is kind of a pretty well-known phenomenon known as the urban heat islands. And because of these higher local temperatures, you have potential for higher heat stress, higher energy use during summer, secondary air pollution, etc. Next slide. And there are many different reasons for this local urban warming. There's like a overview of many different mechanisms by which local urban areas are locally warmer. This includes differences in absorption of solar radiation due to changes in surface reflectivity or albedo, trapping of long-wave radiation due to urban morphology, changes in evaporative cooling due to replacement of natural vegetation with impervious surfaces, etc. Next slide. And we care about this local urban warming because in addition to this local higher heat hazard in cities, most people are now moving to urban areas. So currently around 50% of the global population live in urban areas, and this will go up to around 68% by mid-century. So we care about this because it disproportionately impacts population scale, heat exposure, and the impacts of heat. Next slide. However, one issue with studying this local urban warming is that there are not a lot of research-grade weather stations in urban areas. So here, this is an overview of all of the weather stations in the Berkeley Earth dataset. And among all of the stations, 91% are in rural areas and only 9% are in urban areas. Another thing to note here is that when we talk about urban stations, we are primarily talking about stations in airports, which are not really representative of the heterogeneity of urban areas, as you can see here. And this is why we cannot really use urban weather stations to understand urban heat, especially the wide amount of heterogeneity in urban heat. Next slide. So a lot of work on urban heat has focused on using satellites to estimate what we call surface temperature, which is the radiative temperature of whatever the satellite is seeing. One way to separate out the urban temperature from that of the nearby reference temperature is by using these buffers. Basically, you create these buffers around urban areas and then find the difference between the urban temperature and the rural temperature and call it the urban heat island. However, there are issues with how these buffers are usually used in the literature. For instance, you can see that for the case of Beijing and Tokyo, in both cases, we are essentially using geopolitical boundaries of cities. So if you look at the region around Beijing, it is primarily forested, while around Tokyo, it is still a concrete jungle. So it's not really isolating the urban warming signal. And this is one of the issues with the current use of buffers in the literature. Next slide. So one thing I worked on during my it was not really part of my PhD, but I did it during my PhD. And if you go to like the next slide, it's going to play a video. So let's just start that, and I can talk about that. So what I did was I developed a new methodology to estimate this urban heat island using satellite data, which instead of using geopolitical boundaries, used used physical boundaries of cities, and then land cover estimates. And this created this global data set of around 10,000 urban clusters with seasonal estimates of urban heat islands, long-term trends in surface urban heat islands, etc. There's this web application which you can actually use to export the data. And at the time, it was the most comprehensive such data set available. Next slide. Another thing to note about this local urban warming is that there is also a lot of heterogeneity in urban areas. You can see that here for New York City with different amount of vegetation, different structure of vegetation, different kinds of urban building materials and building structures. If you go to the next slide, what this means is that you have a lot of spatial heterogeneity in the surface urban heat island and temperature in general within cities. Next slide. So one thing we did using the methodology I developed earlier was try to understand census tract level surface urban heat island for pretty much all US cities. And what we found was that the urban heterogeneity also leads to intra-urban variability in population level exposure. And in more than 90% of the urban areas in the US, you have higher land surface temperature in poorer neighborhoods and neighborhoods with primarily minority populations. Next slide. And similar to the web app I showed earlier, and if you go one more slide, it's going to play this video as well. Uh, what I did was I developed this US scale estimate of census tract level surface urban heat island. And this app basically allows you to explore that. What you have here is that census tract level, annual daytime, summer daytime, nighttime, etc., surface urban heat island, as well as the census tract estimates of income, race, and ethnicity, etc. And generally, when you click on any of these urban areas, you will see that it essentially shows the associations between the surface urban heat island intensity during summer and the median income. So here you see a negative association, which means that as median income increases in a census tract, the surface urban heat island intensity decreases. Next slide. Another thing with the surface urban heat island intensity is that there's a lot of evidence that it kind of varies with background climate. What that means is that as you increase the water availability in the background climate, you tend to see an increase in the surface urban heat island intensity. This is seen when you look at that surface urban heat island intensity as a function of the mean annual precipitation. And this is also seen when you aggregate the background climate into combinations of temperature and precipitation, which is done using the Köppen-Geiger climate zones. So as you can see here that for arid climate, you actually see much lower surface urban heat island intensities, sometimes even urban cool islands, while for the other climate zones, you see generally positive surface urban heat island intensities. Also, there's a reversal in the diurnality of the surface urban heat island with lower values during daytime for arid zones, but higher values during daytime for all other climate zones. Next slide. And there is a physical reason why this kind of dependence on background climate is seen. When you're replacing the landscape in wet climate with urban areas, you're replacing land with very large evaporative cooling, which is due to the presence of vegetation, and very large convective cooling, which is due to the morphology of the vegetation, with areas with very small evaporative cooling and medium to large convective cooling. And that depends on like the morphology of the urban area. On the other hand, when you're replacing a dry climate, landscape in a dry climate with an urban area, you're replacing a land with very small evaporative cooling and small convective cooling because of the lack of vegetation and the lack of vertical structure, with something with more evaporative cooling than the dry climate and potentially larger convective cooling, which means that urban areas can actually cool down more in a dry climate than the surroundings. Next slide. So till now, I have been talking about the local urban warming signal or the urban heat island effect. But something I wanted to look at more recently was whether this urban warming signal can actually be detectable at larger scales. And the reason for doing that is that our regular weather stations, as I said, are not in urban areas. So you cannot really get the urban climate signal well within weather station observations. And this is done by design because we don't really want the urban heat island effect to affect our long-term climate signals. However, if we use satellites, which are essentially available for every single pixel on Earth, we don't have that kind of sampling bias. So what we did was we estimated the urban signal on land surface temperature at continental to regional scales. This is done by taking the difference of the land surface temperature for all pixels and the land surface temperature of all minus the urban pixels. And then we looked at the long-term changes in this signal for various cases. Next slide. So here you can kind of see the long-term changes in the daytime and nighttime land surface temperature by continent, and also the daytime and nighttime urban land surface temperature signal. And what is interesting here is that most of these are positive. The only exception is for Africa, for which there's a negative daytime urban LST signal. This is actually consistent with what I talked about earlier about arid regions being generally warmer than the urban areas that replace them. And a lot of cities in Africa are actually in arid regions. When you divide this urban land surface temperature signal with the overall land surface temperature signal for the continents, you get a fractional urban contribution to the continental scale warming. And we see that for daytime, you get this up to around 4% for North America, and for most of the other cases, it's like less than 2%. Next slide. We can also take these urban land surface temperature signals and then project them into the future. To do that, we first estimate empirical kind of dependence of the land surface temperature signal to the urban percentage. So we remove the dependence on time, and then we project them into the future using future estimates of urbanization. Next slide. So here you can see that for different SSP scenarios, which are the shared socioeconomic pathways, we can kind of estimate, assuming that the entire bulk sensitivity remains the same in the future, which is not necessarily true, so we look at it by continent. So for instance, for Europe, at the end of the century, for the SSP5 or fossil-filled development scenario, you can have a mean warming of 0.16 Kelvin over the entire continent due to the expected urbanization. Next slide. So a lot of our estimates for continental scale warming were pretty low, which is expected because we don't expect urban areas to have a very large impact on continental scale warming. And this is in line with what the IPCC estimates. Most of our warming is due to greenhouse gases, and less than 5%, like the highest was for North America, would be due to urbanization. But what is more interesting is at the regional scale, there are actually significant urban warming signals. So we looked at 3 different regions: the Yangtze River Basin, the Yangtze River Delta, and the Indo-Gangetic Basin. So the first 2 are in China, and the third one kind of covers Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And what we found was that, particularly for Yangtze River Basin and the Yangtze River Delta, you can have urban contributions that can cross like 20% during this time period. So this was a very interesting signal and a very interesting result. However, we also see a cooling urban signal for the Indo-Gangetic Basin. And this is because, and this is kind of well known, that in a lot of these regions, the surrounding of the urban area are actually agricultural. And during a lot of the warm season, you actually have harvesting of those areas where they end up being warmer than some of the urban areas that they surround. Next slide. So next I'm going to be talking about surface versus air temperature. Next slide. A lot of the previous analysis was done using land surface temperature because that is what is available globally for every pixel. However, satellites are not giving you the same variable that you feel when you're out and around in a city. And for that, we need ground-based weather stations. So the ground-based weather stations are essentially giving you a 2-meter air temperature, while satellites are giving you an estimate of the radiative temperature of whatever the satellite is seeing. Next slide. There are other differences between the ground-based estimates of air temperature and that from satellite observations. For instance, satellites are only valid for clear sky conditions, while the 2-meter air temperature can be retrieved for all sky cases. Moreover, how satellites view the surface also affects what it sees and what we get from the satellites. For instance, if you have a very wide viewing angle, you are in many cases looking at a lot of like sides of the walls and not necessarily as much of the, say, the roads. While if you have a very narrow viewing angle, so the satellite is just looking straight down, you get a lot of estimates from, say, the rooftops and the roads. And this has an impact on the temperature that you get from satellites. Next slide. So we want, just go to the next slide as well, if you have another figure here. So, oh, sorry. They want one more up. Okay, yeah. One thing we wanted to look at, sorry, earlier one, I think. Yes, this one. So we wanted to look at the comparison between the urban warming signals we get from satellites, what we would get from air temperature. As I mentioned earlier, we cannot do this using standard weather stations. So instead, we use citizen weather stations. We had over 50,000 citizen weather stations over Europe. This is from this French company called Netatmo, who sell these personal weather stations. And then we analyzed the data over the July 2019 heat wave period. And we looked at not only the warming, but we also looked at the urban warming and drying effects, because urban areas also tend to be drier than the surroundings. And this analysis was done over 600 urban clusters. Next slide. So something that we found that was very interesting is that when we compare the surface urban heat island, which is the one we get from satellites, and the canopy urban heat island, which is what we call the air temperature urban heat island, we see that there are large differences in magnitude. So generally, the surface urban heat island tends to be larger. And there are also differences in diurnal variability. So for the surface urban heat island, you have higher values during daytime and lower values during night. And for the canopy urban heat island, you have higher values at night and lower values during daytime. Next slide. And the reasons for the surface urban heat island and canopy urban heat island are also not, I won't say different, but the relative importance of the factors are different. So for surface urban heat island, the evaporation difference, or rather the evapotranspiration difference between urban areas and their surroundings is of the most importance. While for the canopy urban heat island, the difference in roughness, which affects the convective cooling efficiency, tends to be relatively more important. Next slide. So here I'm showing the urban cluster level surface urban heat island and air temperature urban heat island, or canopy urban heat island. And as you can see that for the canopy urban heat island, you have much lower values generally than for the surface urban heat island. Next slide. Another interesting result was related to what I was talking about earlier about the dependence of the urban warming signal on background climate. So here I'm looking at the surface urban heat island and how it changes for different quartiles of precipitation rate. And as you kind of expect that for more humid regions, you have higher surface urban heat island, while for drier regions, you have lower surface urban heat island. But when you look at this for air temperature, you still see that dependence, but the magnitude, the difference in magnitude is much lower. Next slide. Another thing that we looked at here was, so a lot of pretty high profile studies have used the surface urban heat island to talk about what that means for air temperature differences between cities and the surroundings. So we wanted to know if the surface urban heat island across cities is a good proxy for the air temperature heat island for those same cities. And what we find is that it is a very weak relationship during daytime. We see a much better relationship at nighttime, but during daytime, I wouldn't really use surface urban heat island variability across cities as a good proxy for the air temperature heat island variability. Next slide. And as I already talked about, the surface urban heat island itself has a very different diurnality as the canopy urban heat island. But this is also true for land surface temperature as a whole. It has a very different distribution, usually showing much higher values and a greater spread than air temperature, as you can see from the same estimates over the cities. Next slide. And this is particularly relevant when we are talking about and trying to communicate what different parts of the cities experience in terms of heat. It is very common, particularly, well, both in the scientific literature, but also in media articles, to use land surface temperature to talk about differences between neighborhoods, particularly as it relates to potential disparities in heat hazard. So here are two examples from the New York Times and BBC, where they're talking about differences of around 20°F between parts of the city. However, this is for land surface temperature, which is not what we are directly experiencing. For air temperature, you would still see these differences, but the magnitude would be much smaller. So it's important for how we talk about these results and what they mean for magnitude of heat exposure. Next slide. So till now, I have talked primarily about the urban cluster level heat island, but we also wanted to look at intra-urban variability of urban heat. And for that, we divided up the entire urban area, like each urban area, into these deciles. So basically what we are doing is we are looking at the pixels between the 0th and 10th percentile and making a region out of it from the 10th to 20th percentile, 20th to 30th percentile, and so on. And then we are looking at the corresponding values for air temperature and other heat stress metrics. Next slide. So here is an example of what we do for surface temperature and air temperature. So as you can see, as you increase from the background region to the 10th decile, which is the warmest part of the city, you also see corresponding increases in air temperature. But the magnitude of the change is much smaller. And that is, again, important when we are talking about quantifying the effect of urbanization on heat hazard. Next slide. Now, one thing to note about these crowdsourced data is that they have significant sampling biases. Like what usually happens is that you have richer populations buying these private weather stations and putting it in their backyard, which means it's not very good at use. It's not particularly helpful to use these to look at disparities in heat hazard. Moreover, they don't really have a lot of these crowdsourced stations in commercial areas or industrial areas, which normally tend to be warmer. Finally, there's a lot of lack of metadata and poor quality control with these stations. And what we normally do is we try to like throw a lot of data at the problem and hope that averages out some of the uncertainties. But usually that does not happen because in many cases, what you find is that there is a lack of radiation shields in the crowdsourced measurements, which means that they tend to be artificially warmer and artificially drier than the research grade sensors, which is what you see from the bottom kind of left two plots. The next slide. And because of this, we wanted to kind of re-examine the the urban heat disparities within the US, but we couldn't do it using the crowdsourced data. Plus, there's not as much crowdsourced data that's publicly available in the US versus over Europe. So for this, we ran a single layer urban canopy model at 1 kilometer resolution in kind of uncoupled mode, which means that it's not as expensive as running it with both land and atmosphere coupled. Next slide. And what we did was we then took the outputs of the model, aggregated them into census tracts, and then also estimated like parallel observations from land surface temperature to try to compare what we get from the observations from satellites versus what we get from the model. Next slide. So what we find is that, so here I'm showing the sensitivity of skin temperature from the model and air temperature from the model to income. So negative values means that as the income increases, the temperature kind of goes down. And what you will see there is that for both skin temperature and air temperature, you have these generally negative sensitivities, which means that within each city, the higher income census tracts tend to be cooler. However, the magnitude of these disparities is much higher for skin temperature compared to air temperature, which is what we would expect when we think about like the distribution of surface versus air temperature. Next slide. And this difference in surface versus canopy urban heat island is also evident when we look at long-term trends. Next slide. Here you can see that for daytime, the surface urban heat island change over decades is something like 4 to 5 times higher than what we get for the canopy urban heat island. While for nighttime, they are closer together. So again, this kind of brings into question the importance of using air temperature versus surface temperature when talking about the public health implications of urbanization. Next slide. One thing to note, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but when we look at like the urban warming signal at continental to regional scales, air temperature and surface temperature show very similar magnitudes. And this is because for these cases, we are taking regions much larger than urban areas. And for those larger regions, air temperature and surface temperature tend to be much more strongly coupled. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. I think it's the same thing. So since my original land surface temperature based surface urban heat island estimate, we have now developed this global canopy or air temperature UHI data set, which I normally suggest everybody use if they want to think about the public health implications of urbanization. Next slide. So this has several different variables, but the one you're going to be concerned about is the air temperature urban heat island. Next slide. All right, now for the third part of the presentation, which is the urban humidity feedback. Next slide. So I talked about how urban areas tend to be drier than the surroundings. This is known as the urban dry island. So we know that humidity also modulates heat stress. All else remaining the same, as it gets more humid, it gets harder for the human body to sweat and dissipate heat. So in theory, if urban areas are drier, that means there is this negative feedback to heat stress happening due to urbanization. And we wanted to understand more about this and how it relates to the surface urban heat island and the canopy urban heat island. Next slide. So we did this using our original crowdsourced data. So here I'm showing the urban-rural difference in relative humidity. And you can see that most of these are negative, which means urban areas are drier than their surroundings. And also, then we calculated this heat index, which combines air temperature and humidity to give an estimate of how human bodies or humans would feel in ambient conditions. And what we found is that in only around half of these urban clusters, 55%, we see a positive daytime urban heat index island. And in only 32% of them, you see a statistically significant difference from zero. So when you combine humidity, the urban warming signal, as it relates to physiological impacts, practically disappears. Next slide. And going back to the other part where we were looking at the impact of or how the urban warming signal depends on background climate. And here what we see is that when you look at precipitation rate, the relative humidity difference or the dry island tends to have the opposite effect. So it's stronger during in humid region and smaller in dry region, which means that when you look at heat index island, it shows practically no impact of background climate. And this is important because, again, a lot of these very high profile papers have talked about the importance of considering background climate when thinking about urban heat mitigation, but they primarily use surface temperature. And we don't necessarily see that when we look at heat index, not at least to the same level. Next slide. And I talked about this earlier, that how does surface temperature heat island act as a proxy for the air temperature heat island, and it was already weak. And when you look at the dry island, there's a negative association between the surface urban heat island and the urban dry island, which means that when you look at the surface urban heat island versus the heat index island, your relationship is basically nothing during daytime, like R square of 0.04. That's not particularly helpful for providing any meaningful uh, analysis or estimate of how urbanization is impacting heat across cities. Next slide. And this kind of follows up from what I was talking about for uh, the intra-urban variability using those same crowdsourced measurements. Again, for relative humidity, you see an opposite effect. The warmest parts of the cities are also the driest. And what that means is for the heat index island, you only get very little higher heat index in the urban core. But for most of the other decile regions, you actually have no statistically significant difference from the values in the background climate. Next slide. And going back to the question about disparities in heat hazard, this is from the modeling simulation we did over the US. Here you can see that here what I'm showing is the median slope of each of these variables against income. And what you can see is that for skin temperature, you have a pretty high value, like minus 2.12 degrees Celsius on 100,000 increase, or sorry, 10,000 increase in median income. While for air temperature, it goes down to like minus 0.6, while for heat index, it goes down more to minus 0.55. So basically what this means is that, as you might expect, is that all of our estimates for heat impacts across scales from urbanization are smaller for heat stress than for air temperature, which in turn is also smaller than for surface temperature. Next slide. This is from a somewhat different study where we used a coupled model to look at the impact of coastal influence on the gradient of temperature. So this is again normally done using air temperature, but what we found is that when you look at humidity, while the lake breeze or say sea breeze will reduce daytime temperatures closer to the shore, it will also increase humidity. So basically you have again this kind of feedback effect where the humidity is acting to reduce the variability in heat hazard by increasing humidity where it's also cooling things the most. Next slide. Um, so that kind of brings me to another study from a more recent paper where instead of looking at the urban impact itself on heat stress, we looked at the impact of large-scale irrigation on heat stress, because there are similar questions about how irrigation increases humidity but reduces temperature and what that means for overall moist heat stress and overall heat stress as a whole. And what we find is that large-scale irrigation in the US is increasing humidity and reducing air temperature during daytime. Next slide. Next slide. And this was also an interesting way to look at the combined impact of local urbanization and regional irrigation on urban heat stress. So what we find is that there are significant differences in whether urbanization and irrigation increase or decrease heat stress depending on the actual heat stress metric used. Next slide. And you can see that when you compare, say, heat index increases due to urbanization during daytime, but the wet bulb temperature, humidex, and wet bulb globe temperature all decrease slightly. On the other hand, for irrigation, heat index as given by wet bulb temperature increases, but for all other metrics, it decreases. And we actually saw that in the other paper on using crowdsourced data as well. So when we used wet bulb temperature as a heat stress metric, we found basically no difference in wet bulb temperature within cities. Um, and this is important because I'm not saying that wet bulb temperature says that urbanization does not have any effect on heat stress. Rather, what I am saying is that wet bulb temperature is actually a very poor proxy for actual human heat stress. Next slide. And this is actually hard to see from this plot, but there have been a lot more studies on different heat stress indices and how they impact uh, physiological strain and outcomes like health outcomes. And what has been found is that wet bulb temperature actually is at the bottom of all of these heat stress metrics. And you can see that there's like this blue box there showing wet bulb temperature. However, wet bulb globe temperature, which is a much more complete heat stress metric, which also takes into account radiation and wind, tends to be the most important. Next slide. So what we did in this study, which was just accepted, is that we looked at the impact of urbanization and irrigation on wet bulb globe temperature, but also separated out the contributions from the different components of wet bulb globe temperature. So this includes the air temperature, which is the dry bulb temperature, the wet bulb temperature, which is the one that is often used as a proxy for heat stress in the earth sciences, and then the black globe temperature, which takes into account radiation exposure out in the sun. So what we found, especially interesting for irrigation, is that wet bulb temperature shows the opposite direction of change than wet bulb globe temperature, which means it's not even helpful to look at wet bulb temperature to understand the direction of change in heat stress, which has often been argued in the literature. Next slide. So I'm going to summarize because that kind of gives you an overview of like what we were doing here on looking at urban heat across scales. So what we found was that surface temperature tends to be a very poor proxy for daytime heat hazard in cities. And this is true across scales. And particularly when we are thinking about the impact of heat on humans or on urban populations. Moreover, urban dryness, which is due to the reduction in relative humidity in urban areas, tends to counter some of the warming to kind of moderate the variability in heat stress due to urbanization across scales. However, we also note that all metrics for heat stress are not equally appropriate, especially when we are thinking about the physiological relevance to humans. And we should ideally focus on heat stress metrics, which have been shown to work to understand health outcomes in the epidemiological literature. And finally, for the US particularly, we see that the variability in heat hazard, and this is true for air temperature, surface temperature, and heat stress, tends to be associated with how different population groups are distributed, whereby poorer and predominantly non-white residents are living in areas which tend to have higher ambient heat hazard. Next slide. Thank you for your time, and thanks to a lot of collaborators who have contributed to a lot of these different studies. Let me know if you have any questions. I think the next slide just gives you a bunch of papers related to this. And sorry about I think there was like always a lag while I was talking because when the slides are changing. But I'm happy I'm done in the time allotted. So
Yeah, no, and I think that actually was good because it gave people a moment to process. So yeah, if you could, I see some clapping going on with the hand signals. If you could join me in thanking Dr. Chakraborty for that, and also any questions. I know that I know students have a lot of good questions ready to go. So if you could raise your hand or even just unmute and chime in, that's totally fine, unless we get too many people doing that, but I think we should be fine. You can also drop a question in the chat if that's easier. And I think while we're waiting for people to come up with questions for, I'll share some of the questions that I've seen coming from students already. I think one of the key things that people were asking was, sort of what, given the potential for increased heat stress, even though this relative humidity piece is encouraging that it can actually mitigate it to some extent, what should cities do, and what, and also kind of long term, like, what do you think the implications are if cities don't take action for the climate overall, in terms of that warming signal that's adding to other forcing factors for warming?
Yeah, I think something that's always like tricky here is like when you say like what should cities do, like there is a focus on like outdoor versus indoor conditions. A lot of what we do in the earth sciences is really focused on like ambient outdoor conditions. And the question is like, how do you know how much people are actually spending time outdoors? And in cities particularly, most people don't spend a lot of time outdoors during the warmest part of the day, but also it differs between different population groups. Like if you're a blue collar worker, you have very different work conditions than if you're a white collar worker. So I think it is important to kind of think about like who exactly is being exposed to different scenarios, and then decide um, how to address them. One thing that I don't deal with, and I think we don't deal with a lot because they are very relevant at much finer scales, is radiation exposure. So we know like there are less trees in poorer neighborhoods, which has a huge impact on shading. And if you don't have shading, and if you're actually walking on the um, along the road, along the sidewalks, you actually have a huge amount of heat loading that's not really captured in the temperature and humidity variabilities. Um, and 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 that's something I think that cities can focus more on. Like I'm always like concerned with a lot of like smaller cities where you have like you know public transit stops, which a lot of poorer populations take, but in many cases they won't be shaded. And I think that can have a huge impact on population level, like heat strokes and emergency room visits. There have been multiple studies showing how even with this small amount of urban heat, because there are so many people living in cities, you end up having a huge amount of population scale impacts. And we need to kind of try to figure out how to minimize that, both from a indoor and outdoor temperature perspective. I'm always like thinking about how, if you had not just thinking about mitigation but also adaptation. Like there's been a lot of work on, let's say, green roofs and cool roofs. So green roofs are interesting because they don't have much of the effect of shading, and they still increase humidity. So compared to white roofs or cool roofs, they tend to be much worse from physiological perspective. And then you have something like solar panels, which of course may not work everywhere given like climate conditions, but where they do work, they end up providing a lot of energy, which can actually be rerouted to indoor cooling requirements. So in many cases, if you're focused on indoor conditions, where again a lot of people are spending their time indoor during the warmest part of the day, that can actually be more effective than trying to reduce your urban temperatures by like less than 1/5 of a degree, which is what we usually see from a lot of these mitigation scenarios. Um, so I do think like ultimately like street trees are very effective from the shading perspective, which is something we don't really consider in these large scale studies. And a lot of uh, kind of renewable energy, like what is a decentralized solar, might have a lot of impact on indoor temperatures. Interestingly enough, the street trees also actually reduce energy reduction, cooling requirement in buildings if they are shading the buildings. And so there's been a lot of work on that as well, but less from our field, but more from like interdisciplinary fields. I
Great.
think there was a lot of stuff, but
Yeah,
there's a few
no. So
questions.
I think we just have time for like probably one more question. We'll see. But one question from Ryan was about solutions given, like, so you're talking about trees as being important, but then there was the idea that the papers you shared discredited the urban jungle idea. So I'm just wondering how you would sort of.
I wouldn't say discredited it. I think
Mhm.
it is important to note that things, no solution is free. So when you think about adding trees, you have to think about the water requirements. You have to think about whether those trees are actually going to grow to maturity or not, because there have been a lot of afforestation plans, not only in urban areas, but also like globally. And what happens is that you get maybe 50% survivability, which means all of your numbers are now off by half. And you have to also think about like what are the other uh, competing solutions and the cost benefit associated with them. One thing about trees is that there is a lot of evidence from the epidemiological literature on co-benefits of vegetation, which are much harder to mechanistically link to like why things are happening, like reduction in like cancer rates, or reduction in asthma. Like there's been a lot of other factors beyond heat that are relevant when we think about urban vegetation. And the other part, as I mentioned, is that the shading is very important, but that's a very local scale phenomenon. That's not a climate scale phenomenon. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, and somebody is asking, Walter's asking about the citizen weather stations, how they're installed and how reliable their data are.
So I wouldn't. So there has been a lot of work on actually bias correcting the citizen weather station data. So there are like multiple steps that we use to try to make sure that each station is giving at least physically reasonable values. However, a lot of those bias correction techniques are not necessarily focused on urban scale signals, but like larger scale signals. So a lot of statistical outlier detection techniques may work for all citizen weather station, but they don't really account for a lot of the urban signals. And I mentioned that they do lack metadata. So what we usually do is we try to match those weather station locations with impervious estimates at very local scale to try to see if these stations are appropriately sited. Um, but again, I think ultimately that's one of the reasons we did not use these results for looking at the disparity question, is that there are questions about how reliable they are at these scales, especially at the within city variability scale. You're muted.
Yep, thanks. We're at time, so I just want to again thank Dr. Chakraborty for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it, especially, we know how busy you are with so many other important things. So thank you again. If we could give you a hand, and we'll see you soon.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.